family reunion 17 years in the making. The grandmother wrongly convicted, the message she wrote on her shoes in prison, and the one thing she wanted when she got out.
He spent 31 years in prison for a crime he did not commit.
Crown Heights, Brooklyn. 2 off-duty correction officers were ambushed.
I'm an innocent man, Your Honor, and I have always been an innocent man.
Top 10 people found not guilty after serving life sentences. Number 1. Ricky Jackson.
Thank you, Your Honor. Back to the state of Ohio to reiterate what Mr. McKinney said the other day in the state of Ohio. At this time, I'll make a motion to dismiss the case.
All right, the case will be dismissed. Mr. Jackson, you're going to be free to go.
Imagine spending 2/3 of your life behind bars. Ricky Jackson did just that as an innocent man, serving 39 years in prison alongside Ronnie and Wiley Bridgman, who were wrongfully convicted of the murder of money order collector Harold Franks in 1975. The unfortunate events were all based around the testimony of a 12-year-old boy, Eddie Vernon, who was said to have been pressured by the authorities to deliver a false version of events. The most dangerous aspect of this case was the fact that once convicted, all 3 would face the death penalty. Fortunately, but of little consolation, the sentences were reduced to a life sentence in 1977. Ronnie and Wiley Bridgman were both paroled in 2003 and 2004 respectively. But Ricky, who was wrongly considered to be the shooter in the case, stayed in prison another 10 years fighting to clear his name. After Vernon confided in his pastor, the Ohio Innocence Project took the new trial, and Vernon stepped up to the plate and corrected the record. Once Vernon had renounced his original testimony, the judges eventually overturned the conviction, and an emotional Ricky Jackson was finally set free. The city of Cleveland paid $18 million in compensation to the 3 wrongly imprisoned men, but no amount of money can give back the time that was lost or the damage that was caused.
Forgive the man who put him behind bars.
It took a lot of courage to do what you did, man. Thank you, man. That's all right, brother. Yes. We were both victims, man. It's all right, okay? I do forgive you, man. I wanted to be here personally to tell you that.
Despite the horrific circumstances, Ricky Jackson put the past behind him and met with Eddie Vernon as the 2 embraced, with Ricky saying, "It took a lot of courage to do what you did," as Vernon broke down in his arms, continuing, "We were both victims. I do forgive you." The real question is what happened to the police who drove a false narrative based on what was clearly not enough evidence to convict. Number 2. Kirstin Lobato.
Is simple. She was 170 miles away in Panaca at the time of the murder.
DNA testing was what eventually set Kirstin Lobato free from her harrowing nightmare of 16 years behind bars for a crime she didn't commit. She was exonerated following her wrongful conviction in the murder of Duran Bailey, a homeless man, in July 2001. Lobato had admitted to stabbing a man in the groin who assaulted her, and the authorities took this as a confession for Bailey's murder. Unfortunately, the lines were blurred further when Lobato did the unexpected, and rather than take a plea of not guilty by self-defense, she instead denied the crime entirely, which threw the whole case into a whirlwind of confusion. She was then wrongfully convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to 40 to 100 years in prison at the tender age of 18. After years of petitions, appeals for a new trial, and a book on her wrongful conviction, the key that unlocked the door of freedom came when a letter she sent to the Innocence Project was finally opened. Right before Christmas in 2017, a district judge granted a new trial for Lobato, and less than 2 weeks later, she was ordered to be released from prison. Number 3. Luis Vargas.
But on Monday, the 46-year-old was in tears after he was proclaimed innocent.
Another case of eyewitness misidentification led to another 16 years for a man who was wrongfully convicted and imprisoned for 3 crimes committed by the California's teardrop rapist. The acquittal came following DNA testing, which linked one of LA's most evil men to the crime, rather than Vargas, who at the time of sentencing exclaimed, "I'm concerned the individual who really did these crimes might really be raping someone out there, might really be killing someone out there." His statement fell on deaf ears as Vargas was sentenced to 55 years to life in 1999. In 2015, he broke down in court as he was finally exonerated and given $886,000 in compensation, which will never be enough to reclaim some of the most important years of his life. Particularly, his daughter spoke on the steps of his release about the effects it had on her childhood, as at the age of 10, she was left without a father figure.
And growing up, I would cry myself to sleep.
Number 4. Susan Mellen.
Police arresting her at a McDonald's. Mellen was going to buy her youngest daughter a Happy Meal, but she never did.
False tips to the police department led to the imprisonment of Susan Mellen for a crime she did not commit. In July 1997, the murder of Richard Daly took place in Mellen's father's lot. June Paddy, who was heavily regarded as an uncredible witness, provided the police with false information about Susan Mellen's involvement. The truth was, in fact, that 3 gang members had beat Daly to death. Chad Landrum, one of the 3 involved, spoke out about Mellen's innocence, along with Santo Alvarez, the latter who had been acquitted. In 2014, Mellen filed a writ of habeas corpus based on evidence that the witness testimony was unreliable. She was released soon after, following a 17-year stint behind bars.
After nearly 2 decades in prison, Susan Mellen walks free.
Number 5. Lawrence Mckinney.
The exoneration of a man who served more than 3 decades in prison for a crime he did not commit.
$1 million was the highest amount Tennessee has ever granted when Lawrence Mckinney picked up his check for being wrongfully incarcerated. But divide that by the number of years he was in prison, and you're talking a mere $32,000 a year. A pathetic number, considering the circumstances. In 1978, at just 22 years old, McKinney was charged with rape and first-degree burglary. The sentence was basically a life term set at 115 years. 30 years on, the bedding of the victim was tested for DNA, and despite 3 people being identified, not one of them was Lawrence McKinney. The most shocking thing was on his initial release in 2009, McKinney was only handed a mere $75, which he couldn't even cash because of a lack of proper identification. Nearly 10 years on, he was granted full exoneration and thus applied for full compensation, which, as we'll repeat again and again, just isn't enough. Number 6. Graig Coley.
Totally innocent and can prove scientifically and in evidence, both.
Graig Coley fell victim to the lack of competence applied by the investigating officer of a murder committed in November of 1978. The tragic murder of Rhonda and son Donald Wicht propped up Coley as the accused because of his past relationship with Rhonda. Although the first trial resulted in a hung jury, the second in 1980 sentenced Coley to life imprisonment without parole. What made matters worse was, upon the loss of an appeal by Coley, the judge had all the evidence in the case destroyed. Luckily, one detective with more confidence, Michael Bender, started to reinvestigate the case in 1989, citing serious problems with the outcome. Detective Don Swanson from the same department at Simi Valley then arrived at the scene and located more evidence. Forensic tests proved that there was another unknown suspect there at the time, with no trace of Coley's DNA. Following a whole 4 decades behind bars, Coley was released and pardoned by the governor of California in 2017. He received $21 million in compensation in 2019.
The truth is the truth. It doesn't change. I've told them the same story when they arrested me before I even went to trial.
Number 7. Wilbert Jones.
Because the love of God and the Holy Spirit in my life, I don't have no bed in my life. I got to go the rest of my life.
45 years was enough to see Wilbert Jones take the second longest wrongful conviction in history. A very uncertain testimony from a nurse who was brutally raped at Baton Rouge Hospital left investigators in a quandary. During a lineup with Jones involved, the nurse had expressed her concerns to officers when he was picked out, as her description was that of someone of 5'8", 5'9", or 6'3". Jones was literally 5'3" inches tall and had a much rougher voice than the one described by the victim. The prosecution pushed for a conviction of the wrong man and criminally refused to disclose information about another man who fit the description at the time. New evidence of a serial rapist in the area arose years later and tipped the judge, Richard Anderson, to vacate Wilbert's conviction in 2017. Number 8. John Bunn.
I woke up the next day thinking it was a dream, that it was like I was going to be home, that it wasn't real.
A corrupt cop was the reason John Bunn was put away as a teen after the murder of Roland Nasher in 1992. Bunn, only 14 years old at the time, fell victim to Detective Louis N. Scarcella, a man renowned for wrongful convictions and dodgy dealings as an officer of the law. Bunn was released on parole in 2006, but that didn't stop his ambition to fight for his innocence. By 2013, evidence on accusations of Scarcella's misconduct started to surface, and a number of motions for retrials were triggered from his past convictions. Charges were dismissed from the prosecution in 2018, following a judge vacating Bunn's conviction and ordering a retrial. After being exonerated, Bunn broke down in court, pleading with the judge, "I am an innocent man, and I've always been an innocent man, Your Honor." The damage done by the disgraced officer is a tragedy not only to a kid in John Bunn, but to all who fell victim to his horrible service as a detective. Number 9, Devante Sanford.
Being like Detroit tough. Get what I'm saying? Like Detroit, we done been through so much, but like we done rose through the ashes.
Another 14-year-old was wrongfully convicted following disastrous Detroit homicides in 2007. Sanford's attorney allegedly poorly represented him as he initially pleaded guilty to a second-degree murder as part of the deal. Lots of holes were forming in the case, as Sanford was also interrogated without a parent or guardian present for 2 days before he finally caved and confessed to a crime he didn't commit. A professional hitman, Vincent Smothers, eventually came forward explaining that he was the man who had committed the murders, along with numerous other killings. 9 years into his imprisonment, Devante Sanford was finally released in 2016 on the basis that the interrogation was done improperly and not because of Smothers' confession. Smothers still switched positions as he was sentenced to 52 years for the other murders he confessed to. Devante Sanford deservedly received $7.5 million in a settlement that will hopefully provide some comfort for his newfound freedom. Number 10, Eugene Johnson, Derek Wyatt, and Laurice Glover, the East Cleveland Three.
Thank you, Judge.
Congratulations.
The East Cleveland Three deserve to have each and every one of their innocent names read aloud in a final reminder of what can be clear injustice. Eugene Johnson, Derek Wyatt, and Laurice Glover are clearly an example of one of the wider problems we face with wrongful convictions, as the trio were sent down for the murder of 19-year-old Clifton Hudson Jr. in 1996. A 14-year-old witness picked Johnson out of a range of photos placed in front of her by detectives. So the false narrative then began to take shape. After a week in limited investigation with numerous witness reports from neighbors, the trial took place, pointing the figure solely at the three then teenagers. A few days into the trial, however, the young girl of 14 changed her testimony, saying she never actually saw the shooter emerge from the vehicle. Following their harsh sentencing, questions were asked almost immediately of the legitimacy of the investigation that took place. Eventually, evidence was found that the police had withheld witness statements, and the trio's convictions were overturned in 2015. They were given a retrial in 2016 following a much-needed push from the Innocence Project, who had been on the case since 2006. $5 million was awarded to each of them in 2018 after a much-neglected responsibility from the officers who took charge of the case back in the 90s.